community fatigue, how does that affect assessment, and what can we do better not to abuse communities?
Yeah, and I was listening to Pia and I said, yes, yes, and I've seen that. Yes, so completely identify with what you're saying, Pia. Just to give you a practical example, at one point, engagement process that I was involved on from the overarching point of view, at one point there was 4 different consultancies having to, by regulation, engage with communities on different topics. And this was all fixed to regulated timelines. So it wasn't even as if the mine could say, oh, let's just stack it up. It had to be done. It was chaos. And then another point that Pia brought up that I think is very relevant in Africa, where I work especially, is people lose income while attending 5 meetings a day. In certain countries, there's a stipulated per diem that you give someone if they come and attend the meeting. It covers their lunch, it covers their transport. But that becomes a very sticky issue when you zoom out to the G of ESG and look at governance and bribery and corruption. So that brings me to that disconnect between what we think is good practice in our offices in Europe or America or even in Johannesburg, and what would really constitute good practice, what would really give a stakeholder the confidence and sometimes the full tummy to participate. That's the reality of where a lot of the mines are situated. It is not a comfortable setting. Then the other point that Pia makes that I want to reiterate, in my experience over the years, mining communities are becoming, and that's a very collective term, just bear with me, we don't have time to, becoming increasingly more sophisticated in the questions that they ask, because they are better connected with, even if it's with Facebook, with a more informed, etc. And they also have more support from non-governmental associations. However, there is a need when you come with a very technical consultation on a tailings facility and you start using upstream and downstream terms that engineers even have to explain to me very carefully, the need for capacity building, the building up the basic knowledge base of the rural community that you are coming to serve. Which brings me to my last point, is why are we not bringing stakeholder engagement into the 21st century and the 4th industrial revolution? We have videos, we have animations, we have virtual reality for that matter. It could be invaluable. We have 3D printing. It could be invaluable tools to first do a very enjoyable and interactive capacity building session before you stand up and want to engage and get collaborative decision making on a very technical topic.
Sounds good. Which takes me to Pamela, and I'm going to push you on the communication and community engagement issue from a different legacy issues, because Finland has had experiences and we know a number of European countries have had legacy issues. How do you build that trust and community fatigue? You know, community's already been through a horror story. 20 years, you know, whether it's 20 years, 30 years, whenever. How does that, is the community fatigued about talking about mining just because they had to spend 2 generations dealing with something which was a disaster in their region at some point?
You know, I hadn't actually thought of it from that angle in terms of different generations. I mean, in Finland, what we are seeing is that it's really Talvivaara, which was in 2012, which is uppermost in people's minds. So it's non-multi-generational, But I do have to say people they're not just tired of talking about it, they're tired of not seeing anything different happening. They're not tired of not seeing results. And I think if they did see something changing, it would be different. And then I was thinking about, gosh, Romania and Eastern Europe and how different, that whole context is. And with legacy issues, it's in those countries, there isn't a whole lot of conversation going on. There is just no mining, period. That is it. So I think legacy affects people in very, very different ways. And from what I have seen, there are more examples of perhaps government-led community fatigue, if I could put it that way, in Europe than company-led community fatigue. And I think because, again, since I work in Finland, this is what's uppermost in my mind, but having these long, drawn-out procedures that are not in parallel like they are in Sweden, but they're consecutive, the conversation goes on and people don't really see, the point anymore engaging, because the other part to that is, if you can legally open the mine, honestly, it doesn't really matter what the communities say. The government will go ahead and approve the permits. And so there's also this idea of, does it really matter what we're saying? Because legally they will go ahead. And so there's so many different facets to this. Sorry, I'm not honing on one.
No, but it is an interesting aspect of, because all three of you, all four of you have been talking about that this community engagement is a long drawn out process, of spending 3 years with the community, or sort of community mandated engagement through regulations. And there's a question in my head which sort of asks, is this process always slated to be a long one? Can the burden from communities in some way be reduced by making this shorter? Is it just because we've now, in the last 5 years, seriously engaged with processes that look at community engagement? And, we're still learning to fasten this up? Or is this one of those areas where it always will be, you can't do it quickly. If you're going to do it well, you can't do it quickly.
We had discussed, and you had wanted me to talk about BAPE, but that's exactly what the mission of BAPE is. And maybe I will say that to later, but there are ways this can be sped up, and there can be a government agency that takes on this role basically as a pre-negotiating all of these differences. Now, again, this is in the Canadian context, but I also want to say in the Canadian context, and it's my last example, that there are times you can never have too much consultation. And in a sense, so in Canada, in Ontario, maybe 20 years ago, exploration companies were having to spend longer and longer times engaging First Nations, and it was taking a long time. And the Canadian government wanted to incentivize exploration as well, and they were worried this would disincentivize all of these smaller companies. So what they ended up doing was creating basically a whole program in the tax code that makes public engagement a legitimate tax deduction. And they came up with this other investor flow-through share scheme, which is really interesting and complicated. I'm not sure I understand it. But basically having people be able to invest in exploration, and then it's also tied to engagement and legitimate expenses and meeting your due diligence so you can maintain other stuff. But Canada's figured out a way to try to have a win-win situation, incentivize engagement while incentivizing exploration. So if you have populations who are willing to do this, there are solutions out there.
Okay, I'm going to throw one last question in, Rebecca, and then we're going to come to the questions in the field. Rebecca, same sort of question to you. Community engagement, timelines, fatigue. How is IRMA approaching these things?
Sure. I mean, I think just everything that Pierre and Liesl and Pamela have said has resonated so much. There was a comment that a community leader made on a meeting that I was in that was so poignant, and he basically just spoke to the fact that communities are being asked to attend all of these meetings when they may want to be spending time with their families, tending their crops, and essentially they become involuntary volunteers, right? To step up, and whether it be to participate in an audit or potentially monitor mine performance. And if you think of the latter, monitoring the mine performance, his particular concern was, are communities actually being asked to play the role that the state or regulatory agents should be playing. And I think that's a really valid concern, and I think something that we've all spoken to in one way or another. So in terms of the way that IRMA handles it and the way that we try to make the lift as light as possible, is that I spoke earlier to the fact that we publicly notice when an audit is going to happen. So that occurs, and yes, we say on our website, this audit is forthcoming, but we definitely go much further than that, because we certainly don't expect communities and NGOs to be monitoring our website for any of those announcements. So we do the proactive engagement to understand who in the community actually needs to be consulted during this audit process. And then we reach out to them in advance. We explain what IRMA is, how it's different, how it's governed, what the results will be. And so it's a lot of training and conversations before the audit. So then the audit occurs, the report comes out. And what I'll say is just in terms of sort of that level of transparency that we're able to offer through a mine audit, and that 100 pages that I talked about, is that, like I said, the community can really dive in. So we actually just finished an audit in Zimbabwe, the Unki mine by Anglo American. And ZELA, who is the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, they're a public interest environmental organization working to protect the rights of communities there. They published an article about that report coming out and said, it was actually titled Anglo American Under the Microscope, to the point of detail that was offered, right? And so basically, ZELA, we reached out to them in advance to make sure their voices are heard. And we've since held a number of meetings with them to explain the audit report, exactly to get over this hurdle of what the definitions might mean, what the findings might mean, and really work with them to hear what their concerns may still be, and to ensure that they understand the results and that they understand the next steps. So I would say there can be a role, and it's a role that IRMA takes on, there can be a role for the body that is working to advance this certification to actually step in and make the lift lighter for communities in understanding the value that this level of transparency provides for them. So that's the approach that we take, is really as many meetings as it takes, both proactively before and after.
Thank you, because I think that the debate sort of always is, if there's an assessment, how good was the quality of data behind that assessment? And then how good was the consultation process?